Thanks for staying with us on the program. Now, President Xi Jinping's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, launched in 2013 with the sole purpose of recreating the ancient Silk Road and extend China's geopolitical and economic influence through a global infrastructure development push. And this initiative had Africa as a major focus. Now, under this initiative, Chinese lenders provided $170 billion to Africa from 2000 to 2022. But what then has led to this sharp decline since the 2016 peak, which has seen just 7 loans worth $1.22 billion signed in 2021 and 9 loans totaling $994 million agreed in 2022, marking the lowest level of Chinese lending since 2004. Well, joining me to discuss this decline, I have my guest, Trevor Hambayi, Senior Partner with Development Finance Associates in Zambia. Trevor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you join us, Trevor. Now, let's start off by having a better understanding of President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative. This was launched in 2013. How did that come about?
The very interesting aspect around the Belt Chinese strategy was the fact that they obviously had a very clear strategy as to where they want to be by 2030. If you look at the strategies that China was working towards having to become a global power by the 2030. And they have achieved this basically 7 years ahead of time. That China now has become the largest global power. Firstly, it holds the biggest economy. And secondly, is that they've also now become the largest bilateral lender on the globe, especially to the African continent. And that is the issue that they had. So it was basically an issue where it's a geopolitical issue where there's a fight between the West and the East, and the East is positioning itself. Right now, this has been extended with the Ukraine-Russia war, and Russia now has partnered with China to be able to work towards this. They're talking about having to be able to do create a different currency denomination, whether we're using the Chinese yuan as an international medium of trade. And then they're now obviously working towards to put a different degree of pressure on specific international commodities, crude oil for one, and this is also going to come true around the issues with primary agricultural goods, rice, sunflower, that is speaking to a global challenge around the price of these commodity issues. So essentially, China was positioning itself in being able to have a greater hold of the continent. But also what is so important is that China realizes that they have a very large growth of their population. And they are looking at ways of ensuring that they can create a degree of sustainability for that population, this 1.2 billion people that are in China. This is a key fundamental issue, that all the resources that are speaking to be able to sustain the world growth on the African continent. And it is important for these countries to have control on the continent so they have good access to these resources that are speaking to the future. Right now, we are talking about electric vehicles and all the minerals that are speaking to this. Nickel, cobalt are on the African continent. It's important that these countries have got a hold to these minerals.
All right, thank you, Trevor, for that insight. Now, Trevor, Beijing will host its 3rd Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation this month to mark the 10th anniversary of the flagship initiative. And there will be about 90 countries expected to attend. But if these external loans and empowerment programs are reduced or diminished, what then is the purpose of a BRI forum?
So essentially, I think in holding the summit is that China will be looking at ways to be able to try and consolidate their position in terms of supporting the African countries. The first thing that you'll obviously find is that in recent times, there's been an issue around debt distress on the African countries. And the debt distress is basically a major component of those funds that they actually were borrowed from China. And China will be looking at ways of trying to be able to negotiate their position to ensure that they can extend this loan agreements that they do have with the African countries. But in having to do this, China will be negotiating for concessions. And it depends what concession they'll be looking at. Whether it is an issue where they are looking at having to be able to invest into those countries so that they can continue to mine these resources, or it's an issue where they have got concessions for their nationals to be able to come into these countries. If you look globally right now, is that a lot of Chinese are also migrating out of China to go into African countries. South Africa currently holds the highest number of Chinese on the continent. I think slightly over 400,000. That's nearly, very soon, in a couple of years, we'll be talking about 1 million Chinese being in one African country. So this is a strategy that they are also driving. And we have seen this continued migration of Chinese under the pretense that they're actually coming to invest in these countries. So essentially, I think China will be looking at having to be able to get into a position where they can discuss favorable conditions for them to continue to have this linkage between Africa and China.
Right. Trevor, China is currently facing its own problems. You know, policymakers are struggling to revive the growth, but are also battling with consistent weakness in crucial property industry. And this is a staggering currency, as well as, you know, flagging global demand for its manufactured goods. I guess what I'm trying to say is, why is China's economy slowing down that much?
I think there are two factors that have really contributed towards the slowdown of the Chinese economy. The first one that started to be able to bring the Chinese economy's slowdown was COVID. And the impact of COVID lasted 2 to 3 years, that it has continued to be able to impact on the economy. As soon as the economy starts to pick up, there's an issue around COVID. They've also had shutdowns in specific cities in China while containing this. And at the moment, what you do find is that they've also now reduced the level of communication around the position of COVID within China in the last 1 year. That is the first issue that was speaking to the slowdown. The second issue that was speaking to the slowdown of the Chinese growth in the economy was the trade war that they had with the US. US is also one of their biggest trading partners, and then they got into a trade war. So it was over a 4-year period while Donald Trump was president of the US that this conflict continued around trade, and this continued to be able to draw down the Chinese capacity to be able to grow. Post that is that you have found that we have got a point where the economy started to grow, but then there's been global recession. Is that the recession that has come is basically been pushed by issues around the high cost of living, that inflation has been growing faster than the GDPs. This inflation was precipitated by the funds that were released into the economies because they're trying to support post-COVID recovery. These funds came into the economy without any productivity. So there were more resources chasing without any goods that were being produced. This pushed the global space into a high inflation. And this is the issue that most countries have been dealing with in the last 2 to 3 years to be able to recover from this high inflation that has hit the global space. Once we're able to get past this and we're able to get to a point where there's greater productivity beyond the value of the funds that were released post-COVID, then we'll start to see a recovery in the global economies.
All right. Now, some African countries have defaulted in repayment of these loans. Zambia, for example, which became the first country to default during the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this a causative factor as well to what could be the reason that China is now struggling?
I don't think the default by the African countries is a direct reflection as to why China is struggling. In terms of their reserves as a country, China has got sufficient reserves in hard currency to be able to sustain this external shock. They've got more than $1.3 trillion to be able that they're using to be able to support the African countries in terms of the loans. So essentially, I don't think it is a factor. The factor that speaks to this, because of COVID, you find that the trading partners that China had have reduced their trade. And this has reduced China's capacity to be able to generate additional revenue. And this is why there's been a slowdown. So generally speaking, the first slowdown was during COVID, that the industries that were manufacturing in China were not able to export. And we still get to this, even at present, that there's been reduced trade between China and Africa because the Africans are not traveling as much to China to be able to purchase goods. And this has been affecting them. This is what the contraction has been. This is also reflecting with their trade with Europe and the Americas. And that is the key fundamental that is driving the depression, the decrease in economic growth in the Chinese industry.
All right. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this saying, but a lot of people, especially Western countries, seem to believe that China is saddling African countries with unsustainable debt. Now, with all of this default in payment and probably the struggling economy in China, would you say that that assertion is true?
Firstly, if you hear those assertions, is that those assertions will be coming from the West. So this is a geopolitical conflict that they do have between the West and the East. So they'll say a lot of things around each other. But in terms of the debt, I always speak to the fact that our African leaders must act in the best interest of their countries. So when they do get contract debt, they should be contracting debt, firstly, for which they have the capacity to be able to repay. And secondly, is that that debt should have terms and conditions that are favorable to them being able to meet the objective of increasing economic sustainability for their countries. China will also come and offer you the loans with conditions and terms that suit them. And it is important for African leaders to be in a position where they should be able to say, these terms are not good enough for the country. Because essentially, we have always gotten into a point as Africans where we're contracting debt from a position of weakness, when essentially we are in a very, very strong position because of all the resources that we do have. It is just that we've got leaders that have acted in the short term for their personal interest rather than the interest of the countries. If we are working towards having to build the financial capacity of the African continent, we would have enough resources to be able to drive economic recovery without having to borrow money from the West. Because all the resources that generate the global revenue come from the African continent.
All right. Now, the reports also claim that the decline in loans does not necessarily mean an end to Chinese engagement in Africa. But then if China cannot give these African countries loans, what else can Africa stand to benefit from the BRI scheme?
So I do not think that we will be in a position where China is stopping having to give to contract debt for the African countries. That is not going to happen. This is a geopolitical positioning that they are in.
Trevor, are you there? All right, I think we lost Trevor. Trevor, can you confirm you can hear us, please?
Yes, I can hear.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't think China is going to stop having to give debt to the African countries. Right now, it has been a very bit of a challenge. If you were following what was happening to the debt restructuring for Zambia after they defaulted, is that Zambia had half of its debt was Chinese loans. Half of the $13 billion that Zambia had as external debt was Chinese debt. In able to restructure this, the terms and conditions under they were restructuring, the terms were Western. They were being determined by the IMF. But China requested to be able to have a greater degree of impact in terms of how we structured this. And finally, China was sitting as a vice chair of the credit committee in terms of negotiating this. So essentially, is that the key issue is that what Zambia did with their debt restructuring will have an impact with all the other countries that are going to be able to negotiate with China in terms of restructuring their debt. And this is the reason why at the moment you find that China is very cautious about how they're going to give their debt until they get to a position where they have come to an understanding as how they will deal with this issue around debt. And I think China would require individual bilateral discussions with every country to be able to come to an agreement.
That does seem like a smart move. But very quickly, Trevor, and finally, the Belt and Road Initiative seems to have benefited Africa in no small way. With trade links and job opportunities in Western countries, they're saying that China is trying to place the whole continent of Africa under its debt and possibly establish dominance and even exploit them. How true would you say that statement is, seen as the African continent does not exactly have as much to offer? Very quickly.
I think for China, it is an agenda for them to have global dominance. And Africa is a very good place to start from because we're always in need. So that portion is very true. But in terms of the benefits that it brings to the African countries, Africa requires partners to be able to develop its capacity. And it will be able to partner with any entity, whether East or West, that provides it with the best value in terms of conditions that they're going to be providing.
All right, Trevor Hambayi, Senior Partner with Development Finance Associates Zambia. Thank you so much for joining us on One Slot today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
It was a pleasure having you join us as well. Well, we've come to the end of One Slot. Thank you so much for watching, and join us again next week as we bring you topical issues across the continent. I'm Blessings Mosugu. Do have a lovely day.